Wheatley, and welcome to episode 174 of the Wheatley podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in today, wherever you're doing so. I want to thank everybody last week. Very importantly, I'm not sure I would have got the episode done without you. I did part 2 of Moods and Music, and this time it was happy songs. And well, not surprisingly, I got a lot more responses for the happy songs than the sad songs a few weeks before that, but it was really brilliant. And what I loved about the episode in particular was the reasons why people found these songs happy, and certain songs that I'd never heard before. People sent to me, and I got to listen to those and kind of connect with the listener and the person who sent them in. So thanks so much for that. We are on Buy Me a Coffee if you want. The link is in the description. Anyway, this week we have a peatland geographer, and his name is Jamie Rohu. Jamie, how are you?
I'm good, Derek, and how are you?
I'm very well, and I just want to. I know we were just talking before. Rohu, can you tell me a little bit of background about the name?
Yeah, so Rohu it's a rather distinctive and unusual name, to say the least. So Rohu is a French name, and people think, am I French? Or no, I'm not French. It's 8 generations old, I think it's at this stage. So it's a very old name from Brittany, northern France. So there's many stories about how they ended up in Ireland, but we're here now anyway. So we're here a long time. So I'm as Irish as anybody else, I suppose, really. But the roots are there and the name is there, in northern France.
I have this thing, Jamie. I don't know how long ago it was and what episode it was, but I in the introduction I got the name wrong, the pronunciation, not the name. But ever since then I have this kind of underlying anxiety of messing up someone's name, so I had to make sure beforehand.
Most people mess it up, so like messing up is de rigueur, so you're fine. I would expect you to call me something else. So I'm excited in the way you've got it correct. So thank you very much.
I'm glad I checked beforehand. Listen, Jamie, we always start in the same spot. Can you give us a history of your childhood, please?
Yeah, so I grew up in a small village called Inishannon in West Cork. And my mum and her family had come in from Derry in the 1970s. They arrived down to Cork for work, and there was factories getting built and all that kind of thing. So my mum met my dad, and they got married, and they had the 3 of us. So we grew up in a lovely little village. Inishannon is very, very nice now. So it was quite a, it was a very simple little place we grew up in. But lots of family around us. Things were good. My dad got into the building trade. He's well known as a builder, and eventually my parents sold the small townhouse that they had purchased, and then we moved outside of the village to a location, my dad built. So he was able to build houses very well, and he built a really beautiful house in the countryside, and I grew up in really in an area that's rather spectacular. And what you can think about it like is Inishannon is a small village in the bottom of a valley with the River Bandon going through it, and then we lived in a house that was on top of the sort of one of the hills in the valley, so kind of the apex of the hill, so right at the very top. So we could, when we would get up in the morning in the autumn, for example, the mist would hang over the river. It was really beautiful, and so you felt like you're on top of the world. And there's a castle in the distance, and there's a forest, and the rolling hills. It really was a magnificent, it still is a magnificent place, and it feels like the top of the world. And so you'd see every season there. The summer would just stretch on forever. You'd see the sun rising, and then you'd see it set, and there was no undisturbed sky. It was really, really beautiful. And so I grew up in this wonderful home, in this lovely area, and I would have spent a lot of my time as a child outdoors. So I was a really outdoorsy kid. Now, I was obviously in playing my Nintendo, and I was watching TV a lot too when it was raining, but any opportunity I was out, and I would just explore the farmland around my house. There was a field beside me that grew various different crops. So it was usually barley, or it was sugar beet that was on rotation. And that field was owned by a local farmer called Ger. And so the field was Ger's.
Nice.
So Gerrard's Field was where I spent most of my formative years, just rambling around, exploring, fashioning various different weapons, imagining
Yeah.
myself Robin Hood and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I would have been very influenced by nature, I
Mm.
think, at that time. And I've reflected on this in later years because most of your listeners will know me as being someone who likes to give out a lot about climate change
Yeah.
and biodiversity loss. And so I would have, on reflection, probably have had my environmentalism, I guess, develop in that time, because I grew up in a place where you'd wake up in the morning, there was bunnies outside the back everywhere,
Mm.
and there was pheasants, and then there was foxes, and there was sparrowhawks, and there was all sorts of nature around me, and it was really lovely. So whenever I got to 12, my mum and dad's marriage broke down.
Mm-hmm.
And they had had their issues, I suppose you could say, before that. But the marriage broke down at 12, and my dad left. And so that the day that happened, Derek, really was the end of my childhood. It ended there,
Right.
and then it was over. So you were very much a child, with not too much cares in the world. I didn't like school. Like a lot of
Yeah.
kids, I wanted to be at home. I wanted to be, with friends, etc. So you were all of a sudden dragged into the sort of adult world of marriage kind of
Mm.
breakdown, and the implications of that. All of a sudden, on a child, and what does it actually mean? When will I see my dad? Well, I see my dad. Will I have to move home? What's going to happen, the rest of us? So it was really, really hard. And I think that today we have many different types of family units now. And it's the taboo around family breakup
Mm.
is gone now. There's kids, there was a level of embarrassment, I guess, as well, you could say, with that happening, and people in school talking about it and everything. And I guess that taboo is gone now, but the sort of socioeconomic implications still remain
Mm-hmm.
for kids in not all. I mean, many families go their separate ways without any real major issues for the kids, but it still is something that can have profound implications. So that it did have that for me. My mum and dad separated whenever I was finishing 6th class, going into first year in school.
Yeah.
So they couldn't have picked a better time, could they? Let's be
Okay.
honest.
Yeah. I was, let me ask you this then, because obviously this will tie in with what you're talking about, I guess. When did you first become aware of mental health?
Well, what happened to me was, I, as a teenager, I was having to deal with all of this, and we ended up moving house an awful lot. So we left the family home, unfortunately, and so I exited the lovely countryside in which I had developed in, and I found secondary school really hard. Like it was very, very, very challenging for me to get through school. We had to move house several times. So today you have this housing crisis going on, and we have people who are losing their home and they can't find another home, and we experienced that over a decade ago, 20 years ago. We were just, the house would get we would move into a house, and then the landlord would put the rent up,
Mm.
and then we'd find it hard to pay the rent, and then a year later, then the house prices would go even higher, and the landlord would say, oh, I'm selling up, or I'm having financial problems, or so there was always moving house,
Mm.
which is kind of marked my teenage years. Several houses around Cork, the kind of the abandoned area. So we were always, one of the houses, we were in there only 8 weeks, and the landlord found it with dogs, and like, yeah, you have to go or to get rid of the dogs. And the dogs would go nowhere. So they were that was us anyway. So school was really hard. Like, it was really hard to concentrate. There was no money. We had very little money. So the socioeconomic implications of all this was quite serious, And so we've after we were 8 weeks in that house, my mum said, you know what, I've had enough of this, and we need a fresh start. And so I wanted to go to Dublin. I'd finished school at that point. I wanted to go to Dublin because I wanted to study video game development. I was going to be working for Nintendo perhaps someday, or Sony or something. That was the big dream anyway. So I wanted to go to Dublin to study video game development. And my sister, one of my sisters had her partner was living in Dublin at the time, and she wanted to obviously move up to be near him because she was having to commute up and down, I suppose you could say, to see him regularly. And so it made sense for us to perhaps take the break away from Cork for a while, and we moved to Dublin. And it was a really, really good move for the family. But like as a young man in my early 20s, I was working. I dropped out of the video game development course within I don't know, was it 3 months? I just couldn't hack it. Like I was no computer programmer in my leaving cert. Like because I had struggled so much in school, I hadn't huge education from school. I got less than 200 points in my leaving certificate. So it was a case of just pass your leaving cert, because this was a little PLC course that I could go in with just to pass leaving cert. So it was just a case of pass the leaving cert. Many people were surprised I even turned up for leaving cert because they hardly went to school at all.
Okay.
I was more interested in playing video games at home and watching Pokemon. I mean, Pokemon was on 4 o'clock. School finished at 4 o'clock. I don't know how I managed it, but I got home every day from Pokemon. I don't know how I did it, but anyway, I snuck out. So it was a case of prioritizing the things that were helping me. I wasn't wanting to experience the challenges of school. I wanted to kind of, enjoy life because things were difficult. So whatever bit of enjoyment I could get, I got that. So when we came to Dublin, I found it hard as a young man. Like, you're 20. What are my responsibilities here? How am I going to be a man? What is a man? Like, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? What sort of job am I going to get? Education was, there was no education was done and dusted. It wasn't for me. School wasn't for me. I was going to work, but I wasn't going to get a big, college degree or whatever. It just wasn't on my radar. And so, as a early 20s young man, I found it quite difficult to work out where was I going. But I worked in video game retail. Like the gaming I was doing, which I thoroughly enjoyed, it got me a job. Yeah. And I had a speciality. Like people come to me and they go, "Can you recommend me something?" And I'd be able to tell them all the obscure games. I knew every game going basically, and I was buying them and playing them, and that was my expertise, and that was something I figured I was going to be my career.
Yeah.
So working games retail, people listening will remember maybe in Cork, if there's a few people out there in Cork who are same as me, might remember Games World in Merchants Quay. That's where I worked for a long time. And I worked for Game, and I worked for Virgin Megastores. So you might remember Virgin Megastores, Derek.
I do. I loved it.
Brilliant shop.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved working there, and you got into music, you got into DVDs, you got into games. You were at everything there. It was wonderful. So I was in Dublin, and I was working retail, and I lost my job.
Right.
And so, yeah, I was really, really upset about that. So I spent about 6 months on the dole. Right. Couldn't find another job. And when you've got someone who has had a difficult upbringing, and they're unemployed, your mental health does struggle. You do suffer. And I suppose I had anxiety. I suppose I didn't know about it at that time. And so you're asking about mental health. When I started thinking about mental health, well, I guess I started thinking about mental health when I was referred to local employment services. So back then you had the Dole office, you had the FOSS, and then you still have the local employment services, but the FOSS figured that they'd refer me on to local employment services, and I met a woman there called Nuala.
Right.
And when I went in with my CV and looking for a job, but actually Nuala sat down with me and she talked to me about me. And it wasn't, I figured, oh, they're going to give me now an awful hard time in here now they're going to try and get me, crack the whip here and get me a job, and they think I'm being lazy and everything else. And I was looking for jobs everywhere, and I couldn't secure anything. But actually they actually spoke to me like I was a human being who was struggling, and they had a lot of compassion for me. And Nuala counseled me. Now, I didn't know anything about counseling at the time, really, but she spent a lot of time talking to me about how I was and what I wanted to do, and the context I had grown up in. It was the first kind of counseling I ever had, and it was life-changing, really. It was wonderful, and it built me up. and it really helped me. And Nuala suggested that I go back to college. And of course, this idea of me going to college, you're mad. Like, I mean, I hated school. Like,
Yeah.
you know, this was not. I'm a worker here. You know, in fairness, there's a very strong work ethic in my family. You know, you don't be sitting idle. You need to be. I
Yeah.
was working at 13 years of age. You know, you're hustling. You're making a bit of money. You're scratching a living. You have to bring money home. You have to pay the bills. And so, being unemployed was really didn't go down well in my family. And so it was amazing to be met halfway. And Nuala got me started in college, in a college called Senior College in Dunleary. She got me in there. Now that college has since moved, and they're now based in Blackrock Further Education Institute. So they're out there now. And then the Senior College, that building that I would have been educated in initially, they're going to be housing international applicants for refugee status. They're going to be housing them there, so that's really good. So that college, in my first year in college, I had a lot of focus, I guess, on socializing, and you know, I was looking at all the girls that were there, and I was interested in them, and I was interested in going for coffee, and I was interested in lots of video gaming and having friends and fun. And first year, certainly, I had no clue what was going on. I had no idea what a PowerPoint presentation was. I don't know what an essay was. I had no idea what I was doing. And I was on back to education loans as well, which enabled me to go there. I couldn't have went to college without that, actually.
Right.
So it was a game changer. But anyway, I struggled on the first year. Towards the end of first year, like I had about 11 assignments I hadn't done.
Okay.
You know, I had nothing done. Like I had one exam I had to do 3 times. You know, I was just typing away in the library, and it was rubbish I was doing. But the support I got, like, there was one point when I had one lecturer called Jennifer, and I actually had really applied myself to one of these essays about halfway through. And she walked up to me and she goes, "You got a distinction." I nearly fell off the chair. Like, I felt like one of the smart kids in the class, you know?
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. And it was a massive moment for me. I was like, wow, I actually can do some of this carry on here. Like, I can actually do this college stuff. So I felt like part of this, the kind of clever kids, you know?
Yeah.
So that was wonderful. And from there, look, I was late with a lot of things, but I got an opportunity to get a lot of it in at the end of the year.
Right.
And I got a fresh slate. And like, there was one time I was told, you know, you'd have gotten distinction on that essay if you'd handed in time. I was like, really? Okay, this is okay. I have an ability here.
Yeah.
And I kind of got a little bit competitive. And then all the essays I was late with, they let me hand them on in the end of the year. It was a real game changer for me. And the funny thing is, in the second year, then I decided, with more modules to take on, I decided very early on I was going to go in every day. And it was a case of, you know, I'm going to focus on, I'm going to move my attention away from all the other distractions that a young man might have in college, and focus on the college itself. And in my second year, I think it was 9 modules I took, and I got 9 distinctions. So I was on cloud 9 at the end of that. And I decided to move into the degree. And then I focused on the degree, and I went to IADT in Dunleary. And I decided I was going to, you know, aim for the very top. From day one, I wanted this thing I heard called a first-class honours degree. All right. So we were told about this. I said, well, from day one, and I'm going to get one of these. So I focused on it. I'm like, would he ever stop? Like, but I got very competitive. I got very focused and a wee bit obsessed, perhaps. But anyway, I got my first in the end. So that was a massive moment for me. And that enabled me, that again opened doors then. And I was able to get a scholarship then for a master's degree. And, you know, towards the end of my degree, I had another really profound moment in that Duncan Stewart. So some of your listeners will know him from his work as an architect, and others will know his work as an environmental activist and broadcaster. So Duncan Stewart came in and gave us a talk about climate change. Now, I've tried to rack my brains about what did I know about environmentalism before that talk. And I must have seen a documentary or two somewhere. You know, I must have had some familiarity with the topic. It's like, why would I have gone if I didn't? But I think after that hour's talk, I was a changed man. Like, I was moved by the gravitas of the issue that he described, that Duncan Stewart talked about. It was quite shocking. And he told us, he didn't sugarcoat anything. He told us what was going to happen if we didn't get our act together with emissions and environmental degradation. And I took it all in like a sponge. Like I had a great education at that point. I was finishing my degree. I was taking in everything. I was learning everything I could get my hands on. I was studying stuff outside of the college, looking at physics. I was, looking at all sorts of different things, and history and all that. And so learning about ecology from nature documentaries, and then suddenly finding about all this was at risk, was quite something. So I did a master's degree. After that, so I graduated during the recession, so it was a case of go back to the dole or emigrate. So I did a master's degree. I got a scholarship, and I worked then the whole way through it, and again retail, and I kind of developed a bit of a trade, you could say, fixing computers and that. So I kind of found myself kind of going back towards the computers again, and I did a bit of teaching. In the shop I worked in, people how to use computers and triaging phones that weren't working. You'd walk into me with your iPhone, you hand it to me, and within seconds I'd have it fixed. So I learned this kind of skill fixing stuff. Now I've lost it all since, so don't ask me how to fix a Mac. I have no idea. But certainly I would have developed this kind of skill set which helped support me in my education as I went through the master's degree by research. And then after I finished that, I would have went then to look for a PhD. Like when we go way back to my childhood or my teenage years, when I first arrived in Dublin, I did a psychometric test with a guidance counsellor and a gentleman by the name of Jack Griffin. Now, Jack happened to also be he'd been the principal of the college I would eventually go to. So I didn't know that at the time. He, of course, was recommending me education. But that psychometric test back when I was about 18, when I first came to Dublin, that said two things. You should be a lawyer or a lecturer. Of course, this was hilarious, given that I had 200 points in English, right? Lecturer or lawyer, what are you on about?
Yeah.
But anyway, it was funny actually, years later, that's the two jobs I was looking at. So I loved studying law when I was doing my business degree. We did a law module. I ate it up. I knew so much about law, they wouldn't let me answer any questions anymore in the class. I was just reading about law the whole time. But anyway, I wanted to go down that road. But I went down the road of academia, and that's why I found myself doing a PhD.
Jamie, it seems like you have a very strong will towards something. Not even so much as like once you set your mind to it, but once you grasp onto something that is of interest to you. And I know you mentioned about like being kind of competitive and stuff, but it seems like you'll really go for it. Like, you're saying about law there, but obviously what you're doing now, and we talked about it beforehand, that the idea that like you say like in school you just didn't like school, you weren't studying, Pokemon was more important than finishing up a day in school, but then going on to do a PhD at Trinity, it's quite a leap, isn't it?
Yeah, it was quite the leap. I didn't aim for Trinity initially, but what I did was I finished my master's. I kind of took a little bit of a break. I mean, a master's is really hard to do. A master's by research is a different thing altogether because it's like a mini PhD. So you're going out collecting data, you're going out interviewing people, you're going out, I mean, a smaller scale version of a PhD, but still a big document to write. Your degree might not necessarily equip you for postgraduate education in that sense because it is research based. The masters that I did, and of course most masters have a research element now as well, that you would do a taught one. But you mentioned the idea of getting really stuck into stuff, and I guess you could say I became a little obsessed with things over the years. I'd throw myself into stuff. So like if I got interested in dinosaurs, I'd know every single dinosaur going, like. So I would get really into things, and I had all sorts of rather disparate interests that didn't really have a connection, but I'd get fierce into them. Like Formula One now, massive interest in Formula One growing up, and motorsport is really important to me now as well. Even though motorsport and climate change don't sit very well, like I said, there can be these things can be quite different, but getting into things and getting a little bit carried away is certainly something that I have done. Now getting into Trinity, it was a case of shopping around for a PhD and wanting to do a PhD because I wanted to self-actualize initially. You know, like not necessarily the right reason to do a PhD. I want to do a PhD because I wanted to prove something, I think. You know, looking deep down that I could do the highest level of education in the land. And so I wanted to do a PhD because I wanted the challenge, I wanted the difficulty. And when you have a difficult upbringing, it's weird because I almost think I was looking for more difficulty. I was used with things being hard. So like this is all I kind of knew. Life is really tough. Let's go look for more really tough things to do. So because it's all I knew. So you know, you struggle with the finances. You try and hustle a living. I wasn't really motivated by money. Certainly I'm not motivated by money doing all this education because there's not much money in really scholarships. You know, they're they can be really hard to pay your way, you know, on them. But getting into Trinity was kind of an accident, really. And so I was providing computer services to a retired senator. Okay. And she's happened to be someone I knew from work, and it was needing a little bit of office work. So I went in Trinity to an event from Natural Capital Ireland, and Professor Jane Stout was chairing it. And I walked up to Professor Stout, who some people will know from the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. And she was chairing the meeting, and I walked up rather brazenly and I says, I want to do a PhD, here's my master's. So I gave it her in a bag, and she took it in a way, and she fair play to her, she took it in a, and she sent it to one of the guys on the panel. She gave it to him, and he had a look at it. And then he reached out to me, or I reached out to him, I can't remember. And then we had a meeting. And you know, I had lots of meetings with academics, but he said to me in our second meeting, are you talking to anybody else? I was like, oh, well, I'm talking to a fellow in Galway, like, but I don't know if I really was, but I was, you know, I didn't want to make it look as if I was not talking to anybody. I was like, well, I'm kind of having, you know, talking to someone in Galway, and I was, in fairness, a little bit, but, you know, nothing serious that came out of that interaction. But he said to me, you know, I'm interested in taking you on. So look, you know, you leave the door of his office, and the first thing you ring is your ma to tell her, oh, yeah, I'm getting into Trinity, maybe, you know. So that was an amazing moment for me. And then it was a case of you know, writing a research proposal, and you know, my work is characterized by my research into bogs, and you're wondering how have I got into bogs? I'm from West Cork. We don't really have bogs down there, and the reason why is because when I graduated with my degree and I wanted to do a master's, I couldn't afford the 10 grand fees. But I was able to get a scholarship for a master's degree by research that was going to do work on bogs. Now, there was no stipend attached to it. It was everything had been cut at that point, but I had the fees paid. So I was able to work, like I said, in retail to pay the way. So that research was about the after use of bogs. And, you know, I had to design it, of course, but the theme was bogs. And what does Board do when they're finished with a bog? So I had no idea, but I knew I wanted to do something that was about environmental focused. So this was environment, and it was also business, because Bord of course, is a commercial semi-state. So it really ticked the boxes for me, and I really enjoyed it, and I indulged my scientific interest and everything in it. I had a great time with the masters. I had a lot better work-life balance, I'm telling you now, when I was doing my masters than I did it during the PhD. But when I did the PhD, it was a case of, it was just, you know, I had sort of anxiety, I suppose, you know, really from a young age. I think that I suppose that had perhaps developed even before my parents' separation. And so I think how that worked out was I was always worried about the future. You know, so it was a case of, what if this happened? What if that happened? And that still is the case. You know, academia is not a very secure world to be in. A lot of contracts that are very short, and there's lots of situations where you get funding for a certain amount of time, and then it's a cliff edge, and where you're going to get funding from then? Oh, the application will open for a year, and then it's another year before you get the funding. So it's really quite precarious now, and we're training so many PhDs. It's quite competitive now, these different positions that are out there. So there's a lot of PhDs getting trained, and there's like so many jobs. But I did my PhD on Bord and I did the PhD on I guess I built off my master's, but I kind of looked at the kind of geography, the kind of social aspects of these places, and the implications for workers and communities as the bogs were shut down. And my work, I suppose, the most important finding really, and people in the Midlands who are, they are experts on their own spaces. They'll be nodding along, go, well, I could have told you that. The big thing is that these bogs would decline for years.
Yeah.
That was the big finding. Bordemona shut down its bogs, and Fishy announced it in January 2021. But it came after a High Court ruling in I think it was 2019 that this was basically against the European directives, environmental directives. They had to stop extracting, and so I wrote a whole chapter on this and the closure. But really, the board was declining in terms of its peat extraction for since the mid-80s. Would you believe? If people can remember the ad they had for they did merino waltz playing, and the lovely fire lit in the 1980s. You think Bordemona would be flying it back then, briquettes and everything were very popular, but actually the board had overexpanded its operations from the 1970s in response to the international oil crises.
Right.
And so Bordemona had went into bogs that had previously been deemed uneconomic. They were quite small, and they took on all the people, and then all these people lost their jobs. So in the 80s to early 90s, we had a huge decline in Bordemona. And so we this idea of just transition that we hear about now today, which my PhD kind of hangs on.
Yeah.
That was probably more applicable back in the 80s than even today, because you'd all these people losing their jobs back then, and huge issues for communities and small businesses as more and more factories were wound up, and plants like ESP power stations and technology developed as well. And things became more efficient, but people weren't when they retired or they left, they weren't replaced. So your workforce shrank. So the Midlands have had this really, what I call a long decline. But simultaneously, Bordemona was also kind of going through what I call a long transition, in that they were developing wind energy, which you'll see wind turbines in the Midlands in cutaway bogs. And Bordemona has been evolving as a company, and I've studied Bordemona really my whole postgraduate career. It's a fascinating organization to study, and I'm hoping to continue researching Bordemona in the years ahead.
You mentioned about so the social aspect of it, and obviously the economic aspect of it, but I'm down here right on the edge of a bog, right? So when I go for a run, I go there's a road directly through the bog and up around it and back to the house. And in the last couple of weeks, I started to notice the cutting is going on, and you hear the machines, and as far as the social aspect, in a few weeks' time, people will be out there doing lining up the turf or bringing it home and things like that. And there is a big thing to it when you're around it. Like when you see it, it's like everything. When you see it going on, it's like there's meaning to it, there's life to it. And we spoke again about almost like the city versus country debate when it comes to that. And you've lived rural and you've lived urban. What have you seen about that, or some of the kind of opinions that you hear about that, between that kind of clash between urban and rural?
Yeah, so I guess I'm a rural person in my heart. I grew up in rural Ireland, but I never cut turf. So I spent a lot of time with turf cutters. So I suppose you could say 80% of my PhD was focused on Bordemona, but I did a lot of work with turf cutters as well. Like my focus was peat for energy. So it was about peat being used in briquette factories, in power stations making electricity, and as people cutting it themselves privately to burn their own homes. So I was interested in peat for energy as a kind of concept. And the people I spent time with, and I absolutely love the Midlands. I love Offaly. I'd love to live down in Offaly someday. It was a really special place to me, and the people there were wonderful. And those people that were cutting, I suppose they would look at me as being someone who was urban. I mean, he's come from Trinity, he has to be urban. But I also understood the kind of rural aspect, the socioeconomics of. It's really hard sometimes to make a living in rural places. There's not the jobs there. Like whenever I was growing up in rural Ireland, I worked in Cork City. I had to get the bus in, and big long bus journey in and a big long bus journey out. And so I understood that there is this socioeconomic aspect. With regards to turf cutting, why people still cut turf, there's a cultural aspect there.
Yeah.
People have been doing it our lives, and people don't need to be told, here, what you've been doing with your dad and your mom since you were 7 is wrong. They don't want to hear that. And to them, it's not wrong. It provides them with a secure source of fuel. They're thinking to themselves, why would I go and import oil out of the Middle East and then burn it in my house when I can cut the bog up the road and it's my bog and I've done it all my life? And sure, what harm is it doing? The problem with the turf cutting is it's not replaceable. So the bogs aren't going to grow back anytime soon. That doesn't mean that those habitats aren't really valuable. Like the cut over, which is the area of bogs people have cut and they'll dry their turf out, they'll foot their turf. That area, when it's kind of re-wetted, it becomes an amazing habitat. I think cut over is highly underrated as a habitat. So you'll see, if you walk around the cut over bog in the summertime, you'll see spider webs everywhere and birds and everything. So cut over is great. Now, obviously, the high bog, when you can re-wet it, has a huge abundance of rare species turns up on that. Talk about curlew, which are on the absolute edge in Ireland now. You've got all these interesting little bog plants like sundews and bladderworts, and they all catch insects. These little insectivorous plants, fascinating and so biodiverse and so different. But the rural, like I was able to understand the rural perspective. But like I would give the view that the reason why people are cutting turf is because of the economic more than the cultural. I think it's cheap. I mean, you can get your bog cut, right? You pay the contractor, or you might say to the contractor, look, take a bit for yourself. And it could wind up free. And you burn that, you put it in your shed, you burn it over the winter. You're not having to pay for, €1,000 for a drum of oil out the back. It's your bog, you feel you have a right to it. And so I understand that. Like I went in as an environmentalist, of course, but as a scholar, you have to put your own opinions to one side. You have to take off your own opinions. You have to meet people as you find them and take them and write objectively about what's going on. So it's a great saving of money. And people do like spending time outdoors. They like spending time together. Communities like to come together. It's a big event. But certainly when you're living in a rural area and you're wanting to send your children to university, because there's no universities really, in the middle of Offaly, where you've got Athlone, but this you have to send your kids, to live, right? So they have to live. They can't live at mum and dad and then go and get the 46A bus in the morning they have to live, and you have to pay for that. And so if you can save some money cutting turf, and then you give that to your kids for their education, you'll do that. And I understand that. The problem with the thing is with the bogs that we kind of take them for granted now. So we're used with them, but really Ireland, like we've got very little active raised bog left in Ireland. That's the bogs in the Midlands, the raised bogs, the big dome-shaped lakes that filled in, thousands of years ago and then grew up and outwards. Those bogs are extraordinarily rare now, and we have some of the best in Europe. And if we look at them differently, we might appreciate them in new ways. Like Clara Bog, I don't know, have you ever been to Clara Bog? But
no.
Well worth a visit. Like Clara Bog has got, a couple of small little lakes in the middle of it. Like the bog split and water gathered in these little cracks. And there's not much nutrients in the bog, but it kind of pooled in these little cracks. And you've kind of fen-like habitat developing, and it's really, really unusual. And you've got this bog woodland growing on top of the bog. And bogs don't have, like I said, much nutrients, so you can't really grow a tree on a bog. But these trees have developed in these sort of fissures in the bog, but there's a little bit of extra nutrients has accumulated. And these little stunted forests, there's only about 200 hectares of these things in Ireland. And so we have this incredibly rare habitat there that we kind of take for granted. People don't really know about. So when we cut turf, we cut bogs, we are destroying our natural heritage, and we're destroying habitat for wildlife, and we're destroying areas that are really unique. But at the same time, I understand why people do it. And we've never been told in the past it was wrong, and people continue to do it now. And so this is why just transition is so important, because you need a transition to other alternative forms of sustainable energy that aren't going to implicate people on the ground. So that is what my work has been all about, this idea of just transition. And despite having studied it for 4 to 5 years, I did my PhD during the pandemic, and so it's a slight delay in the middle of it, where I couldn't leave and finish my fieldwork in the Midlands. But you have a situation where people are cutting in good faith, They are doing it because for the right reasons, but they are increasingly realizing the ecological value. And some of the most strongest advocates for bogs today are people who used to cut them in the past. If you go down to, Clara, which is one of the central points of my research, the people that cut the turf there, phenomenal people. If you went cutting there now, there would be a lot of trouble. They wouldn't stand for it because that's their bog now, and they understand it's being preserved. But I would have studied a lot of what the state did and the role of the state in all of this, and what the state could have done better. And that informs my thinking on just transition. It needs to be state-led, and we need to define what just transition actually is. And we haven't really done that, I don't think. And I have, like I said, spent a lot of time studying just transition, and I couldn't give you a definition of what it means right now in Ireland. It's just such a big topic. And so there's, like all researchers will say, there's more research needed.
Yeah. Okay. And speaking of big topics, now this is kind of interest to me, and I follow you on Twitter, and I see that you talk about this a lot. But with regards to anxiety, and I'm quite an anxious person, you mentioned about the fact that anxious people or people with anxiety have this worrying about things in the future, constantly worrying about things that are going to happen or may not happen, but looking to the future. And a lot of people will have heard the term climate anxiety, and maybe some understand and maybe some don't, and I think I do. And what does it mean to you?
So in terms of, like, I've described my upbringing there to you, and I would say that my formative years were lacking stability. So you're constantly moving houses, you don't really have much money, you're struggling to pay your gas, electricity, putting food on the table. That makes you a person who, I guess you'd say, has, like a sort of, I wouldn't say a vulnerable person, but someone who is prone to being scared of things and fearful and worried and expecting maybe the worst. And so I would be anxious about what's going to come in the future. And then I find out about climate change. And so that is a big future topic. And we're sitting right here now today. It's a lovely day outside. It's not too hot. But climate change as a subject, this is a really big thing. And I like big ideas. I like to study big things. But whenever I started to throw myself into this and follow so many amazing and activists online and reading around this, and I realized that we're probably poorly equipped as a species to deal with something like this that requires collective joined up thinking and action. I mean, right now we kind of know what's causing climate change. We know what's happening, we can measure it. We know what we need to do. We need to reduce emissions, but the problem is that's a highly political thing to do. To reduce emissions means there's going to be winners and losers. There's going to be trade-offs. So some people are going to have to stop cutting their bog, and some people are going to maybe, have to move from one farming model to the next, and other people are going to have to stop flying for work and going to have to use Zoom. All these sorts of things, right? So we need to collectively, every one of us, take climate change very seriously. And people have been putting it along finger for a long time, and the state has been really poor on leading on this, and we've all these lofty plans, and then you have situations where people you're scaremongering one group and you're putting them against another. So like farmers and environmentalists and urban and rural all against each other. Whereas really we have an awful lot in common. And I've spent a lot of time recently trying to figure out where the common ground is between an environmentalist like myself and someone who obviously cuts a bog in PhD, but also increasingly farming. And how can we reach a middle ground in Ireland that we have farming, but we also have environmentalism and we have wildlife. And I think that farmers are well aware that there's no curlew anymore on Cork, and there's no kestrels on their farmland, and they want the right actions taken. They want the right policies. So actually, I think farmers and environmentalists have a lot more in common than what divides them. But in terms of climate anxiety, and you'll often see me on Twitter, if people follow me there, they'll see I often be giving out about things, giving out about the language used in the news, or giving out about this policy not being implemented, or rowing back on that policy, or things like, for example, the thing that drives me absolutely bananas is the cutting of hedges.
Okay, yeah.
Season. Thankfully I haven't seen it in my area recently, but there's nothing that gets me more angry than to see trees being pulled down with birds in them and the chicks in the nest in the biodiversity crisis. A lot of people who are doing it because they just think, oh, that hedge needs a clip, or that's untidy looking, or that's my job. I'm a tree surgeon. I'm busy in the summertime. Things are getting overgrown, or I've been hired by a government body to go and tidy up along the road here, and you're trimming hedges, and there's wrens in there that we can't see because the nest is so camouflaged. We can't see them in there.
Yeah,
they're getting killed in the nest. We're breaking the law. I mean, these animals are protected species, and we're effectively breaking the law in Ireland all the time in terms of environmental damage.
Yeah.
So anxiety, that's grounds for anxiety, definitely. Like if you grow up in an area where you've been shaped by beautiful nature, okay, and of course I think the removal from that space, certainly, that was rather traumatic for me, being pulled out of my beautiful home as a 12-year-old into this. We lived in an urban area afterwards. We went from one house to the next, all urban. That certainly has shaped me. But to see anybody really who looks into this, that sees the degradation that's happening in front of us, and to see such economic development take place at the cost of what we call nature. It is really, really hard. So I think a lot of people who study this, it's very, very difficult to maintain some sort of balance. It's a bit like a guard or a nurse, and they're exposed to awful things every day. It's very hard to park that, and I have been less successful at parking it than some. I know some people who are activists, that they can put a little distance between them and their activism and their advocacy, but I find it quite difficult. And so sometimes family would tell me, would you ever put that Twitter away, will you? I feel like, what else can I do? I have to let Leo Varadkar know about this. I have to, let Micheál Martin know I'm angry here about this, or they mightn't, we need to do something in the media about the way they're communicating. You feel a sort of a sense of, I have to do something. I can't just sit here idle. But I have been able to put some sort of distance at times between me and the environment. And I have, like, for example, I talked earlier about my gaming. Playing a video game will take my mind off of it. Spending time in nature is a really, really good thing for me to do. I love spending time, in nature. But then I see a hedge getting cut, or I see briars getting cut back, and I'm thinking to myself, those hedgehogs and those briars may be hibernating. And so when you are educated in the environment, and you do spend time in nature, and you have that lens, that education, you see all around you the rhododendron, the too many crows, the corvids. You see magpies everywhere, and we shouldn't have so many magpies in Ireland. We have it because the nature's degraded, and we don't have a lot of specialist species because there's no specialist environment anymore. It's all very general. There's grass everywhere, and a bit of a hedgerow here and there. That's very important, but we kind of have a general environment now. It's grass everywhere. You grass in the parks, you grass in the farms, you grass out the back garden, and it's all cut very short. And with a lack of diverse habitats, and so we need to add that biodiversity back in there. We need to restore the bogs, and we need to have farmland that isn't just a monoculture of ryegrass. We need to have our lakes need to be clean. We need to have our coasts protected. We've a massive job of work there, and I wish we'd get started. I don't think we've started yet in Ireland, really actually starting to restore. We have restored areas and some great work going on. There is bogs that have been restored, but I think almost in our consciousness, in our collective mindset, we haven't really begun to restore nature as a nation. And we really need to do that, but we have to ensure that no one's left behind. We can't throw anyone under the bus. If you're going to ask a farmer or a turf cutter to sacrifice their livelihood, there has to be something for them, and we need to figure out what that is, and we need to speak to them. So if you're talking about just transition, you need to ask, and this is what I did in my PhD on, I was only one person that was limited time and resources. We need to start asking people what a just transition is. Why aren't we talking to farmers about what does a just transition mean to you? And those people, will say, well, a just transition to me might be taking early retirement, or maybe I want to move from one type of farming into another, but I don't have the money to do it. Or I want to keep my cattle, but I want to let some of my farm have, wildflowers in it.
Mm-hmm.
How do I do that? So we need to figure out what just transition actually is, because as a word, it's a bit like sustainability. It gets thrown around here, there, and everywhere. No one really knows what sustainability actually means now.
Mm.
The definition has been lost.
Yeah.
So we need to figure out what just transition is and actually implement it. The state needs to really to knuckle down on this and lead by example.
For sure. I don't think you should leave Twitter alone. Because I think it's like you say, you feel that you need to say these things, and it's in a passionate, educated way. It's not like a lot of Twitter that's not done that way, And I think there's something actually. There's another thing, and you mentioned so many kind of animals there, right? So as you were talking about like nature and what live in our around us all the time, and you have a great love for animals. Was that always there?
Yeah, so animals are probably the thing in my life I love the most. So,
Mm.
talk about biodiversity. I mean, as a young person, seeing a sparrowhawk was phenomenally informative. This beautiful bird of prey flying around. Um, and foxes and rabbits and all sorts of animals and badgers, fascinated with that growing up.
Mm.
In terms of my love of animals, that kind of has come in two ways. So I gave up meat in my late teens, early 20s, and then I eventually became vegan. I'm vegan 12 years now.
Wow.
So that's one aspect of it. So there's a sort of a rights violation in animal agriculture that I disagree with. Pets have been very, very close to my heart over the years, and I would have had the most amazing animals ever growing up. Holly was my golden retriever. She lived till she was 16. She's my soulmate, still is. So she's gone now a good few years, unfortunately. But the relationship you develop with an animal, the friendship, the companionship, I walked with Holly, the golden retriever. Yeah, I walked her every day and twice a day sometimes. She didn't like going 2 walks a day. She's more of a 1 walk a day kind of woman, She's a bit
Yeah.
lazy. But anyway, we walked, like, thinking about it, 16 years of walking. We walked like the length and breadth of Ireland probably numerous times, like 10 times. If you think about how much walking was done.
Yeah.
And when you walk a dog, you get to know the dog better than just having it in your house. You really
Yeah.
get to know them, like out in the walk with you and the dog. And so I had a huge connection with Holly. And I guess the sad thing is, and you love these animals so much, and I've cats as well, and at a Cavalier King Charles called Ben, and you develop these amazing relationships with them,
Mm.
but the more you love them, the harder it is to say goodbye to them eventually.
Yeah.
And so you spend a huge amount of time when your animal gets older trying to keep the show on the road, trying to keep them going. You're bringing them to vets, you're getting them this, you're getting them that, and it's rather nerve-wracking, and you're trying to struggle to pay the bills, because the vets are amazing. Where would we be without them? But it can be difficult when you have a 300 € bill all of a sudden. So vets are I couldn't say enough about the amazing vets that have helped keep my animals going over the years, and I'm so grateful for them. But you say goodbye, or you watch them decline, and you watch a dog that you struggle to hold on to on a lead, being a dog that you're giving them earthly aid to help them walk in their dinner in the morning, and then they're slowing up, and then their legs aren't moving the way they used to move, and that itself has caused me quite a lot of distress.
Of course.
Over the years, watching animals lose weight and then eventually bring them to the vet to say goodbye, it's devastating. And so that would have certainly added to my mental health over the years, watching decline and trying to just keep them going as long as you possibly could, because you knew that your connection with them was so valuable.
Yeah.
So animals, they really are very special. So I try and do everything I can to protect animals. Yeah, if I'm walking along a path and there's a snail on that path, there's a very strong chance that snail's getting lifted and put on the wall when I'm walking past it. That's where we're at. I value every little thing going. And so, I try to protect them. And, when we talk about my environmental activism, climate change is obviously a big problem for wildlife. But climate change is very much a big threat to us.
Yeah.
Our civilization, if this planet keeps heating up, it's going to drastically affect us. But biodiversity loss is something that I have very much focused on, because it's about animals. It's about the variety of animals and animals living. And I have so much respect for an animal that gets up in the morning, that goes out and lives off the land itself. Like you and me wouldn't last, Derek, very long out in nature. Would be in a lot of trouble very quickly. Whereas, you look out the window, whenever's out there, be it a robin or a thrush or a fox, they're surviving on their own, and they're doing it by themselves. And I have so much respect for the fact that animals are able to do that. They're adapted for that, but they're able to just get by, and they're sitting out in the trees in the wintertime, freezing cold, and we're in our centrally heated houses, and we think we're better than animals, but really animals have their own unique qualities, and they're all fully deserving of our respect, and we must protect their habitats, their homes, and we must help them help themselves. So I was reading this morning about a research published in Queen's University, about 48% of Earth's animals that they surveyed, I think it was 70,000 animals they looked at, 48% are declining. So even things that we take for granted, a lot of them are declining. And then you have this kind of imbalanced nature where you've got too many one species and not enough of another. And that has huge implications. And eventually, even though I feel my biodiversity advocacy is about we need to protect animals for them, it's not about us. Ultimately, loss of biodiversity will impact on us, because it's going to mean the loss of our pollinators, it's going to mean the loss of species that depend, that we depend on in so many complex ways. I mean, nature's extremely complex. We'll never fully understand how it all works, this web of life, and we need to do everything we can to protect that. And so a little bit of climate anxiety actually can be good for me, because it does motivate me to move forward. But it does affect me sometimes in a negative way. I do get quite down and frustrated. So if Leo Rodkar and Micheál Martin and Eamon Ryan are tuning in today, please do more to protect the environment and the laws that are there. Please do, implement them. And yes, that's
very,
all of us.
Very well said, Jamie. It just reminded me when you talked about Holly there. I had a few episodes back, I had a pet loss specialist on, and I didn't know exactly. Her name is Louise Griffey, by the way, but I didn't know exactly what she did. So I haven't had pets growing up. We had the family, but I mean, they weren't mine, or you know what I mean. So, and when I spoke to her, I was kind of started to understand and appreciate the people around me who do have dogs all the time, or cats. So, it doesn't have to be dogs, obviously, but the idea of that, the love that they get from them, and how devastating the loss is for animals. So when you hear people like yourself talk about, animals that you had, saying was your soulmate and still is your soulmate, it's, my eyes are opened a lot on this podcast, from when I started to different things. And that's definitely become one of them, as how important pets are to people in general, and then taking this, I suppose, different pathway with you, Jamie, and I know we kind of wanted to talk about this, video games, right? So you mentioned about, like, even when you were young, playing Nintendo and stuff. What is it about video games that you love so much?
That's an amazing question, and I've never been asked that, actually. I don't really ever discuss video games, with people anymore. I had a lot of friends growing up who were into it, but what is it about video games I love? I loved collecting. I enjoyed the collecting aspect, growing up. I liked to get games on special offer. It was nice to get a game that you knew was worth €60 and you were getting it for 25. Bargains, I'm a bit of a bargain hunter. I used to buy a lot of games from Japan, because this was before, difficulties with finances and that, in college. But I used to bring a lot of games in, and it was a sort of a cultural aspect to it too. You'd be learning a little bit about other cultures, and you'd be seeing what the types of games that they'd be popular else in other countries. But I just like the sitting down and the challenge, and the learning the controls, and the excitement. And I talked about motorsport briefly at this top. I love racing games. I love getting a car in a racing game and driving the virtual wheels off of it, and trying to get the best time.
Yeah.
And I don't really play online, but there's enjoyment to be had playing Mario Kart online, and winning. But gaming, there's so much to it. There's the magazines that I used to read, and there was the sort of the learning about, this is a game I've never heard of before. It's made by this company, and then you can go and order that, and you buy it and you play it and you try it out, and there's definitely there's an awful lot to explore there. So I found it a really fascinating area to kind of learn about.
Yeah.
So I got really into these rather esoteric companies that no one ever heard of before. And to me, these were like treasures, these sort of little hidden gems. Of course, like today, YouTube, there's all these big YouTubers there, these big stars, and they have talked about all these games, and people are very familiar with lots of these types of games now. YouTube has blown the lid open on gaming, and you can find anything on there now. And these lists and these recommendations and these collection videos and pickups and everything else. But for me, it was very much about discovery and about always looking for that next buzz.
Yeah.
I've never tried this game before. I'll see what it's like. Oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And you'd be like, I must try the next one in the series of that game. And you go get the next one, you play that. It was all this discovery, this sort of adventure into this entertainment medium. I mean, you can apply the same to film or music as well, or books. Yeah, it's something that I would have, I suppose, used as a sort of a coping mechanism, perhaps an escapism.
Yeah, I was going to say that to you. Like, was there a sense of because films would be my things, and I do find that for me is the escapism and the removal, or at least the kind of dampening down of my anxiety. Would you say that for video games as well?
Yes. So playing a game, sitting down with a game, you are distracted for a few hours, and it does take your mind off things. However, your mind can wander whilst playing, and you can certainly engage in all kinds of thoughts whilst gaming too, that maybe you mightn't have in other situations, because if something's kind of monotonous, your mind can wander too. But in general, if you're sitting down playing something like Zelda, and you're doing a lot of puzzle solving and you're adventuring, you're not going to be focused too much on your problems. You'll be figuring out how to get to the dungeon, or where you're going next, or and so I think that gaming can give you a bit of a break from worrying about your problems, and it can take you away. What I would find sometimes, if I am stressed out, and during the PhD, which was really quite stressful, as the institution of the PhD is a stressful thing in and of itself, right? It's really hard, to say the least. But I wouldn't have been able to play much video games during the PhD because my head was too tired, and so you'd probably just use YouTube, or you'd look at Sky News or whatever. You wouldn't be able for too much heavy gaming, and so sometimes I wouldn't be doing any gaming at all. And that was when I was not gaming during the PhD. It was definitely a sign that I was experiencing stress, and I was maybe needing to roll back a little bit, because during the PhD I didn't always do it the right way. I was very much is there a right way to do a PhD? I don't know. But I think the wrong way of doing a PhD is to do it 7 days a week for 2 years without taking a break.
Yeah.
So that was very much, it's very hard to let go of it.
Yeah.
Because, you've got anyone who has a PhD that is listening in, they'll know the first thing you're going to get when you start a PhD is imposter syndrome. Do I belong here? No, I don't. Everyone else is much smarter than me. And then you have to go and maybe get yourself some money and some funding. And that's, of course, it causes worry. So the PhD is a bit of a space where you're going to be doing a lot of worrying, and so there's a good way of doing it and a bad way. Certainly, you need breaks. You're entitled to breaks. I didn't feel I was entitled to any break, because I felt I don't belong here. I need to, I'm in Trinity College. I need to, I need to compete with the best minds in the country, in the world. There's, so many people coming to Trinity from all over the world. I haven't got 2 minutes. I have to focus, which is a wrong thing to do, because you need a break. You need to give yourself time. And certainly you would get mental fatigue. So I guess when I wasn't playing my games, I realized, right, maybe I need to take a small foot off the gas here. But it was very challenging to I found during the PhD it was very hard to manage a work-life balance. It was much harder than when I was doing my master's, which I worked during the master's, and I worked during the PhD as well. I was teaching as well, and I was overseeing exams and all that kind of thing as well. But there wasn't a spare minute really in the PhD space. But work-life balance, people deserve a break.
Yeah.
And if you're not playing your video games, if you're not watching your films, if you're not going places and doing things other than your PhD, then you need to take a look at yourself and go, I need to engage in some self-care here. I need to realize that the PhD isn't me. I'm not my PhD. I'm doing a PhD, but I'm not my PhD. And so I would have certainly gotten very stressed out during the PhD. And I would have spoken to the college counselor as well, who was wonderful, about the stress that was having on me. And I would have done quite a bit of talk therapy, at one point in the PhD, which stitched me back up and got me back going again wonderfully. So
Brilliant.
I was able to finish off. So talk therapy, something I've done over the years. Like I mentioned at the beginning when I first did it, I've done it since. I did it whenever my dog Holly passed away. I had to go to, I had to talk to a therapist about all of that. And I remember crying, a grown man crying his eyes out over losing his dog and the impact it had on me. And maybe, yeah, I took it quite hard, and it took me a while to kind of get over it. If you ever get over the loss of a loved one like that, I would have valued talking an awful lot. And I think that talking about your problems and men, as a stereotype that men don't discuss their problems enough, I think it's really important that if you are struggling with your mental health, whether it be depression or anxiety or anything like that you do reach out to people. And I think that, Derek, this is a really valuable podcast because it is giving people a platform to discuss these issues, but it's giving listeners a kind of a space to understand how other people are experiencing things. And I have to say, one of the best bit of learning I've ever had was that every bit of anxiety I've ever experienced, every bit of stress, there's a lot of people out there who have the same thing going on. You're not alone, really. Everyone's got their problems and their stresses, and everyone reacts to them in different ways. But certainly, I would feel that you're not alone, and talk to other people out there. I know it's a bit of a truism at this stage. You need to talk to open up, but certainly men need to chat more about mental health with each other, and that allows people to feel that they're not alone and that they've common ground with other people. So do chat about it. It's really important.
100%. And the thing about it, Jamie, what I've noticed in particular since starting it is the number of people who are willing to come on a podcast to talk about it, and there's other podcasts doing it as well, of course. And I think it's a great thing. It's such a important thing that, people are just thinking, oh yeah, well, I can come on and talk about what I do, but I can talk about mental health because this happened to me when I was young, or this happened to me now. And it's just like the way it should be. It's just a normal thing. It's what people go through.
Yeah, we all have mental health. Like, there's not sort of this binary of there's normal people and there's people with mental health. Everyone has mental health. Everyone's going to experience the human condition. We're all going to experience stress. I think, though, that sometimes stress gets a little bit too much for some people.
Yeah.
Today we live in a society where we're all under enormous pressure to look after family, children, older parents. You're paying your mortgage, you're renting, we've all so much worry. Like, the society we exist in today is just set up for stress and anxiety. And anxiety really is when stress gets a little bit too much for a person. And it becomes a case where it affects them in their life. You might, for example, have problems with your concentration or your digestive system or whatever, and it's stress related.
Yeah.
And so it does have a physical impact. For me, I would very much find that I would be worried about going to places that I'm unfamiliar with, and I would ruminate about that for a few days beforehand. And I would look at people at an event, go, oh, they look great. They're happy days. They got there, and it's just another day for them. But for me, sometimes, if I'm going away, for example, somewhere, you're getting, we need to get a taxi and you get a train, and I worry about what happens if the taxi doesn't turn up.
Yeah.
And I'm not at the event, then people are expecting me to be there. You get this train of worry about, and it doesn't sound too bad when I describe it like that. Actually, that's not a big deal. but it's a way of thinking that I have every time I'm going somewhere.
Yeah.
Worried about, oh no, what if? And it's a lens I apply to a lot of situations. Now, there's things that I do that I've lectured in Trinity. I've stood in front of groups of people. I've no problem public speaking because I'm kind of used with that now. And some people think, oh, how is he finding going to a place? Well, you just don't know. Are you going to miss a train? Are you going to, so there's all these implications of, if I don't go there, I'm letting them down. Or what happens if I get sick if I'm there? These are all the things that you just worry about and worry, and you have to push yourself. And I have pushed myself. Like, I haven't backed down from doing things because I've been anxious about them. I've always gotten through them as best I can, but it is a little bit harder for me. And maybe it is for other people, or maybe not. Maybe everyone's experiencing this, because anxiety and mental health struggles are, like I said at the answering this question at the beginning, it is everywhere right now. And so people coming on talking about it, I think the taboo has been lifted around it. And I think, okay, there's obviously space for more people to talk about it. There's obviously some people who aren't talking about this enough in our society, but many people are now talking about it. And you asked me, the second question I asked you was, when did you first kind of discover mental health or whatever? It's not something that my family would have talked about growing up. And it was only when I started doing a bit of talk therapy that I actually understood that, mental health is a thing. But today everyone's very aware. Children in school are aware of it. And I think we need to encourage people to look after their mental health as much as we do their physical health. But I think, like I said, without wanting to labor the point, our society today is set up in such a way that mental health issues are nearly baked in, because of the stress of the work. And like inside in work every year, you may have targets. You have to increase your targets every year. You have to sell more stuff. You have to work harder. You might have to be on a contract for 5 years, and your contract is up. You have to work harder than the year before to maybe try and be kept on, and you mightn't be kept on. There's this instability. Whereas long ago, people had their own homes. Now there's a lot of renting going on, and we have seen the housing crisis now, where there isn't enough houses for everybody to go around, and so there's numerous issues. You just sit down and look at the news at night. There's people listening to this will have their own stories. People have problems with the hospitals, their health in hospitals, and that only makes them more unhealthy when you're struggling with access to health. People wanting to get an education, they can't afford the education. There's so many issues we're living with today in society, so it's hard to navigate it. But like I said, talking about the issues and bring them up with family, and sharing them, it's probably the beginning of, I suppose, your road to recovering. I think sitting down and talking and just beginning that kind of conversation. I'm struggling here. I'm finding it really hard to do X, Y, and Z, and just owning up to it to yourself, that actually it's okay to struggle.
100%. Jamie, where can people find you? What's your tag on Twitter? Because I think that people will probably want to head over there.
Well, you can find me at Jamie Rohu. So you can see me on Twitter giving out. I try and keep it positive at times. I do a little weekly book review. I like books, so I often talk about a book from my collection and just how I use it in my PhD. So I'm doing that, and I highlight newspaper articles and I just pass comment on them. And I also like to try and highlight the amazing people that are doing brilliant work on our behalf on climate. We have in this country, despite it all, we have some of the most incredible climate activists, advocates, campaigners. We've got an amazing environmental non-government organizations. They know who they are. These people talk to me every day. We've got some just phenomenal people out there that are fighting the good fight, so that we'll all have, hopefully in the future, a more biodiverse, more stable environment to live in.
100%. Jamie, you've been a joy to talk to, very educational, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Derek, for all your hard work, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
No problem. Listen, Jamie, if you don't mind, now I know I say this at the end of every podcast, I'll just close this out. I'll get a photo. I'm collecting I'm going to have a mural there of all my guests from these photographs. So if you don't mind, I'll close what I need to do and we'll take a photo. Is that good?
That's no problem.
Brilliant.
Absolutely.
So I also want to say thanks to John Francis for all his tech support. I always thank my mum and dad, granddad, Jaron Calvin, very important people. Subscribe to our YouTube if you would. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. The Weekly, obviously. The podcast platforms are Spotify, Apple, Anchor, Google Podcasts, etc. Obviously, a big thank you to everyone for listening today. And we'll be back next week. I mean, the clue is in the title. I hate every time I say that, but it's just now it's in my head. So I say it like it's a motto, but it's a motto I don't really like. But Jamie, once again, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye.